I do is in the name of Mac Dre. That was my friend, and I was by his side every chance that I could be. So it tore me apart not to be there when he got killed, because I felt like I was supposed to have been there.
The vehicle had over 30 bullet holes in it, some through and through. Two types of weapons were used: a larger caliber AK-47 type weapon and the .45 caliber weapon, both very destructive.
You get this kind of sensationalized story of payback. Behind the scenes, the story is a lot more complex.
The rumor that shot through the street like a wildfire. You got justice, you got street justice.
This was the streets talking. The streets.
November 1st, 2004. At 3:30 a.m., police in Kansas City, Missouri respond to the scene of a highway shooting. When officers arrive, they find a white van crashed at the bottom of an embankment.
The driver of the vehicle was injured, but managed to get out of the van and find someone to call for help.
The vehicle had over 30 bullet holes in it, some through and through the vehicle. The windshield and all the glass was all broken out, either due to the crash or due to the bullet holes going through it. They saw one body laying outside of the vehicle. At that point, they called the homicide division, and a murder squad was dispatched to the scene. And were able to go through the pockets and attempt to identify who the subject was. They determined it was Andre Hicks.
34-year-old Andre Hicks is a popular figure in hip-hop. He raps under the name Mac Dre.
Mac Dre was an up-and-coming rap star through the West Coast and in the Kansas City area. And that's when the indication was that there could be a whole lot more to this than what we have at that point.
Andre Hicks was born on July 5th, 1970, and grew up outside Vallejo, California. He and his friends liked to hang out in an area on the northern edge of the city, known as the Crest.
The Crest is definitely a family-oriented neighborhood. If you hear a certain name, you knew that family. Like, that family got cousins, uncles, nephews everywhere. We actually have a word that was invented in the Crest called cutting. You know what I mean? Like cousin and buddy together. So we always called each other cutties.
Like many teens in the Crest, Andre was heavily involved in the Bay Area music scene. By high school, he'd adopted the stage name Mac Dre.
Mac means to master the art of communications in Mac Dre terms. That was his philosophy.
Everybody didn't rap like today. Like, in them times, you was special if you had the gift to rhyme words. I think it was a talent show where I first heard him rap at. I was like, man, oh yeah, he got it.
Mac Dre's talent was matched by his ambition. In 1989, when he was just 18, he released the single Too Hard for the Radio.
Back then, music was passed around through tapes, cassette tapes. It was a hit, people liked it. So he set the bar with that. He lets you know, I'm not a radio artist, I'm an independent artist, and this is what I do.
It was just energized, energetic. When he brought it back to the neighborhood, everybody was like, man, Mac Dre is the neighborhood spokesman now.
Dre's clever, hardcore rhymes quickly earned him a following, and his friends were determined to make him a star.
We was putting all our money together.
We was trying to make sure Dre had everything he needed to get to the top, because he gonna bring us up.
By 1992, Dre had dropped 3 albums, and his fame spread along the West Coast. But his meteoric rise was grounded in March of that year.
This particular day, we was working on a song, me and Dre together. Kilo calls me like, we going today? Yeah, we going today. I'll be done in a minute. Dre hear me talking to Kilo about we finna go to Fresno. He say, I'm feeling this little chick out there I wanna go see. We met at the show. I stay at the hotel. Y'all go do y'all thing, come get me afterwards. All right, fine.
But it wasn't an innocent trip to Fresno for J. Diggs and Kilo.
The situation with me, Dre, and Kilo is, I robbed the banks. Kilo robbed the banks. That's what we did. Dre had nothing to do with that.
After several successful bank robberies, J. Diggs and Kilo were preparing for another one in late March of 1992.
It wasn't a plan for Dre to come, but Dre ended up coming. You know, we going to the stores, buying the stuff. We did everything. We usually always be prepared. We didn't know that we was under surveillance.
We in the bank parking lot, me and Kilo. I tell Kilo, you ready? Finna get out the car, and I see a news van. And I'm looking, I'm like, hold on, we don't see the cameras. Got dark windows on the van. So me and Kilo both like, man, something ain't right. So I'm like, you know what? We're not doing it. We never got out the car. Left the bank, went back to the hotel, picked up Dre. Took about 5 minutes for a police car finally pull up on us and pull us over. They jump out, guns, arrest us. We get charged with conspiracy to commit armed bank robbery, attempt to commit armed bank robbery.
Police reportedly offered Dre a deal to testify against his friends, but he wouldn't do it.
He refused to snitch on anyone that may have had anything to do with the bank robberies.
You know, he just kept the G code solid all the way.
We went to trial, lost in trial, even Dre. His was conspiracy. His whole conspiracy was he knew that we were going to do it. They know that he had nothing to do with it. He stayed loyal to his crew, and he went and did 5 years at Lompoc Federal Prison for that.
Dre didn't let that time go to waste, however. He remained focused on his music and even recorded an album from prison.
There's 2 phones. They sat right by each other. So he would have to double call. Basically, on one phone, he had the beat in his ear. He'd call to the studio. That's how he would record. So everybody like, oh man, Mac Dre just made a song from jail. Man, that's crazy, woo, woo. So it was big. It had never been done before.
In August 1996, Dre was released and began performing again. There was no denying prison had changed him.
Prior to Dre going to jail, Dre was, you know, he was real into the streets. But when he came home, he just got on a different vibe. And this is when he had switched his style from being so serious to having fun with his music.
Yeah, well, I'm from the Bay Area, man. The car's the first thing that the bees see when you drive up, you know what I mean? You come up in your whip, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's your debut, man.
It's Mac Dre, almost Mac Dre alone, that kind of invented hyphy.
Hyphy. It's this unbridled release of energy that could be frustration or joy simultaneously. Yes, it's fashion. Yes, it's language, but it's also car culture. It's also dancing. And so he was very much a part of weaving all of those pieces together, articulating a narrative that's very specific to Bay Area.
Like Dre was like hella dope. Like it was like before his time. On his time being independent, he just had a different swag.
That's what I liked about Dre. Dre was confident in doing him.
3 years later, in 1999, Dre created his own record label, Fizz Entertainment, and started signing other Bay Area artists.
Mac Dre being a natural leader and the architect of Fizz Entertainment, this big record label that, you know, had all of his friends, he was feeding a lot of people.
This is someone that becomes a pillar in the community that creates a pathway for opportunities outside of his everyday neighborhood.
He would push me, to get the best out of me. Like, I see your potential. It was more of a situation where my mentor became my best friend.
He had to really tell me, look, bro, we can make some money from this rap shit. This other shit we could be doing. We don't gotta rob, we don't gotta do none of that shit, bro. Just pay attention.
By 2004, Mac Dre had released more than a dozen albums, and his underground popularity stretched into the Midwest.
Kansas City and the Bay Area had kind of shared a mutual affection for each other's hip-hop scenes, and their music was even stylistically similar.
Kansas City became a second home for us. And as much as they was with it, it gave us the energy to be like, it took us to another level.
But now, this once promising career has come to a violent and tragic end. Mac Dre has been found dead after a drive-by shooting on the highway. And from the evidence at the scene, it looks like a targeted attack.
2 types of weapons were used, which was determined by shell casings at the scene. One was a 7.65, which would be a larger caliber AK-47 type weapon, and one was a .45 caliber weapon, both very destructive. Witnesses reported about 2:30 in the morning, the white van was traveling northbound on 71 Highway, just south of 75th Street, when a black sedan pulled up next to them and started firing rounds into the vehicle.
It looked like whoever was in that dark car really wanted to make sure Mac Dre ended up dead.
Kansas City police are investigating the murder of Bay Area rapper Mac Dre, who was killed in a highway shooting. Word of the attack spreads quickly amongst his tight-knit group of friends.
When I go down there, now the detectives and the police and everybody down there. And they're like, are you here for Andre? And that kind of threw me off, because I'm like, how you know the Cuddy name? I'm like, yeah. Like, yeah, he's gone. So I'm like, gone where? To the hospital? Like, no, he's gone. I'm like, how?
When I found out what had happened, I'm like, no, bro, you tripping. And I'm really kind of like hysterical. I'm looking for something to hit, punch. I'm just reacting to him telling me that our best friend just got killed.
As Dre's loved ones process the news, investigators speak with the driver of the van. Dre had just been involved in 2 concerts over the weekend, one on Friday and one on Sunday, Halloween night. According to the driver, he was taking Dre back to the hotel after the Halloween show when a car pulled up alongside them.
His van is ambushed by a dark-colored sedan. More than 30 bullets are fired into the side of the van from 2 separate guns. The van is also rammed by the car, as if it's trying to run it off the road. And eventually it works. The van is ran off the road, lands in a ditch. Mac Dre's body is thrown from the vehicle and lands in the mud.
The driver says he managed to pull himself from the wreckage and ran for help.
The driver fled the scene on foot to a nearby hotel where Andre Hicks's crew had been staying.
Investigators are curious to find out whether Mac Dre's entourage know of any enemies he has in Kansas City.
It felt like the walls was closing. Because now it was like, you don't even know who to trust.
One of the names that surfaces during the investigation is Damon Whitmill, an up-and-coming promoter who brought Mac Dre and other performers to town.
He was very young at this and possibly not really good at what he was doing at this point. But Whitmill offered Andre Hicks $12,000 to come and perform, plus airline tickets and a hotel room while he was in Kansas City.
When police contact Damon, he explains there was originally supposed to be only one show on Friday night, but he says it didn't go well.
Mac Dre showed up at the concert 30 minutes after he was supposed to stop performing, which caused the promoter to have to rent the hall for an extra hour that night. Mac Dre was accompanied by 20-plus people in his entourage, which caused problems at the concert. Eventually, the concert had to be called off due to the unruliness of the crowd.
Damon Whitmill would later tell police that he lost $6,000 from the show being shut down early.
Damon says after the show, Dre agreed to make it up to him with another performance.
It was agreed that Halloween night, this is a Sunday, that Mac Dre would do a club appearance. And Damon Whitmill tells police that he was hopefully going to make some of his money back that he lost. But that Sunday comes about, and Mac Dre shows up late again, and he's under the impression that it's going to be just a club walkthrough, and Damon Whitmill tries to get him to perform. And Mac Dre kind of says he doesn't want to do the performance, it's just going to be a walkthrough.
So he left approximately 30 minutes after being at the Halloween party.
Because of the friction between Damon and Mac Dre, police wonder if the fledgling promoter may be connected to the murder.
In addition to Damon Whitmill losing money, I think Mac Dre embarrassed him by not showing up to the concert on time, not taking it seriously.
Despite the possible motive, investigators can't find any evidence connecting Damon or any of his associates to the crime. Given Mac Dre's popularity, they know if the case isn't solved quickly, payback violence could escalate out of control.
You got justice, you got street justice.
This is one of the most notorious murders in the history of rap music. Mac Dre was an incredibly popular rapper. His fans were calling for blood after this murder.
The Kansas City rumor mill soon offers up another suspect.
Fat Tone was the name that the streets fixated on. Everyone kind of involved thought that he might have had something to do with it.
Anthony Watkins, known as Fat Tone, is a Kansas City rapper with a violent reputation. Word is he'd had some beef with Mac Dre in the past, and he'd already been charged with first-degree murder in a previous unrelated shooting.
He would eventually be released for what police say was a lack of witness cooperation, so something happened. Can't say for sure if he did that. He was never convicted. But he had this image in Kansas City as someone, not to be messed with.
Two weeks have passed since the murder of 34-year-old rapper Mac Dre, and police believe they might have a new suspect, a Kansas City rapper known as Fat Tone.
His real name's Anthony Watkins. In the days after the killing, there were dozens of tips that said Fat Tone was seen getting in an altercation with Mac Dre at that Halloween night show.
So his name was ringing all over Kansas City. Fat Tone did it, Fat Tone did it.
On November 16th, detectives track him down.
Fat Tone gave an interview and a plausible alibi and told police that I didn't have anything to do with it.
According to Fat Tone, he and Mac Dre weren't enemies at all. They were friends.
There was a collaboration between Fat Tone and Mac Dre and another artist from 2002, 2 years before the killing. Fat Tone told detectives that He knew Mac Dre was going to be in town, and that they had even smoked weed and hung out on the night Mac Dre got in.
Fat Tone says he wasn't even at the Halloween show, so the rumors of him getting into a fight with Dre couldn't be true.
When we think about the rumor mill and Payback, oftentimes in the streets, is somebody's talking to somebody, and usually they're trying to find out the source. But what ends up happening is they end up muddying up other people's names, implicating folks that have nothing to do with the actual incident, and falsely accusing the wrong person.
Other associates corroborate Fat Tone's alibi.
I personally didn't believe Fat Tone did it from my investigation, but this was the streets talking. So here you had the streets convicting Fat Tone.
Kansas City police clear Fat Tone as a suspect and begin looking for new leads. But a few months later, on May 23, 2005, their fears about possible retribution for Mac Dre come true.
There were suspects that people thought of, and next thing you know, we find out those suspects are dead.
Fat Tone and his friend Cowboy are both found in a car in a cul-de-sac outside of Las Vegas, in like an unbuilt housing project.
Fat Tone was slumped in the front seat. He'd been shot over 20 times. Cowboy, whose real name was Jermaine Atkins, was outside the vehicle a few feet away. He'd been shot 13 times. From the shell casings, police determined the gun used was an AK-47.
Now, investigators have 3 murders to solve, and if they don't work quickly, there could be more to come.
If someone killed Fat Tone because they believed he shot Mac Dre, then someone else might shoot whoever killed Fat Tone. Then they've got a serious problem on their hands.
A witness tells investigators she was awakened by the sound of gunfire just after 1 a.m. And when she looked out her window, she saw a white Pontiac Sunfire fleeing the area. Police immediately put out an alert for the vehicle. They also reach out to Fat Tone's contacts and discover he was in Las Vegas to meet up with a Bay Area rapper named Andre Dow, also known as Mac Minister.
Mac Minister apparently told Fat Tone he could introduce him to Snoop Dogg and possibly get him a gig as his opening act.
So Fat Tone travels to Las Vegas with his friend Cowboy and was, excited to meet Snoop Dogg.
Police searched the MGM hotel where Fat Tone and Cowboy stayed. The rooms don't offer much in the way of evidence, but the hotel does have security cameras.
There was video footage that Mr. Dow was in the MGM hotel the night of the murders with the 2 alleged victims.
All 3 were caught on camera leaving the MGM just 80 minutes before Fat Tone and Cowboy's bodies were found.
But the allegedly promised meeting with Snoop Dogg never happened. Fat Tone's friends believe that Mac Minister made the whole thing up in order to lure Fat Tone and Cowboy to Vegas. Once again, the Kansas City rumor mill has a theory why.
Similar to Mac Dre's killing from Halloween in 2004, the streets were almost immediately talking, and Mac Minister becomes the first suspect in the Fat Tone and Cowboy slangs in Las Vegas. And it immediately becomes a situation where it seems to be retaliation for the Mac Dre killing.
Las Vegas detectives are investigating Bay Area rapper Mac Minister in connection with the murders of Kansas City rappers Fat Tone and Cowboy. Surveillance video shows Mac Minister leaving a Las Vegas hotel with the 2 men just before they were killed. And that's not the only thing pointing to Mac Minister's involvement in the double murder. On May 25th, 2 days after the shooting and 500 miles away in Vallejo, California, police recover a car matching the description of the vehicle seen fleeing the crime scene.
Police discovered a white Pontiac Sunfire matching the description 2 days after Fat Tone and Cowboy were shot. It had been set on fire, but importantly, the VIN number was still intact. Registration showed that the car belonged to a 21-year-old Utah woman named Lee Danae Larson.
When investigators run a background check on Larson, they discover she's connected to Mac Minister through her boyfriend, Jason Mathis.
Mathis also goes by the name Corleone, and he turns out to be a close associate of their suspect, Mac Minister. Larson's father filed a police report accusing Mathis of forcing her into prostitution. He said Mathis would escort her to various hotels with an AK-47 under his clothes, which of course is the same weapon that was used to kill Fat Tone.
Larson's bank records show she bought ammo for Mathis's AK-47 at a local gun shop on May 14th, just 9 days before the double homicide.
The gun shop had video footage of Larson and Mathis with the AK-47 and said they had also sold Mathis a folding gun stock for the weapon. They left in the same white Pontiac Sunfire.
Police obtain a search warrant for Mathis's house, located just 2 blocks away from the spot where Fat Tone and Cowboy were killed. Inside, detectives find several more pieces of incriminating evidence.
In the garage, there was a gun cleaning kit and a magazine for an AK-47. When they test those fingerprints, they find a match for Mathis. In the house, they find a picture of Mathis holding the weapon with a child in his lap. Another photo shows Mathis with Mac Minister partying with 2 women in Vegas. These guys were clearly close friends.
Based on this evidence, on November 2, 2005, authorities indict Andre Mac Minister Dow and Jason Mathis on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Investigators arrest Mathis without incident, but cannot find Mac Minister.
When police arrested Mathis, he immediately hired an attorney who called Mac Minister to let him know that he was also going to be facing charges and he needed to turn himself in. He obviously decided not to do that.
While investigators believe Lee Larson was involved, there's not enough evidence to charge her. They instead ask her to testify against the 2 men, but she refuses to talk. 2 days later, on November 4th, the case takes another tragic turn.
Lee Larson is found murdered in the street outside of her apartment building. She had been shot in the head.
Larson's neighbors say they heard the gunshots, but didn't see who did it.
Her friends had told police in the weeks before she died, she had called them and told them that she was in trouble and her car had been involved in a double homicide and that she didn't know what to do and that she needed some money.
Although there's no evidence her slang is connected to the murders in Las Vegas, investigators suspect Larson was killed to make sure she didn't testify in court.
It's widely believed that Mac Minister or Mathis was responsible for her death, kind of tying up all loose ends that could have linked them to the death of Fat Tone.
Authorities increase their efforts to locate Mac Minister in the hopes of putting an end to the bloodshed. In February 2006, he's featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted.
They've been searching for him for over 3 months at this point with no luck. The interviewer calls in a tip to the FBI.
Las Vegas police are still searching for Andre Mac Minister Dow in connection to the shooting deaths of 2 Kansas City rappers known as Fat Tone and Cowboy. So far, Mac Minister has managed to evade capture, but on March 2, 2006, investigators act on a tip that he's hiding at his girlfriend's house in San Francisco.
Mac Minister was eventually arrested after somewhat of a large standoff.
Extradited back to Las Vegas to face trial, Mac Minister denies any involvement in the murders of Fat Tone and Cowboy. claiming his public image and his association with both Bay Area and Kansas City rappers makes him an obvious fall guy. But as he awaits trial, Mac Minister produces an album entitled Minister of Defense, which seems to capitalize on the notoriety.
People thought some of the lyrics on the album referenced those murders, which police took as further incrimination. But Dow's lawyer insisted that he might be capable of basking in negative publicity, but he's not capable of murder.
The high-profile nature of the case makes finding a suitable jury difficult. After some delays, Mac Minister's trial begins in July 2008. The prosecution argues that Mac Minister and his co-conspirator, Jason Mathis, murdered Fat Tone and Cowboy in retaliation for the death of fellow California rapper Mac Dre in 2004.
The state's theory at trial was that Mr. Dow had lured, allegedly, the two victims to Las Vegas to a 10-day concert with Snoop Dogg, and also to help them in the music industry as a ruse to murder them.
The Clark County coroner testifies that Fat Tone and Cowboy were both shot more than a dozen times by an AK-47 assault rifle. Their bodies were destroyed by the high-powered rounds.
An AK-47 is a powerful weapon. It's a weapon of war. This was overkill. This is the kind of thing you do when you just don't want someone dead. You want payback.
A firearms expert also testifies that not all of the shell casings found at the scene came from the same weapon.
They can already prove Jason Mathis owned an AK-47, but there were casings from a second gun too. That meant there was a second shooter. The prosecution set out to prove that shooter was Mac Minister.
The most damning piece of evidence comes from the car Fat Tone and Cowboy were driving when they were killed.
At the time, it was unclear whose car it was. When police ran the plates, it came back registered to a school teacher in California. But when investigators talked to her, she said she sold it to a student of hers. That student was Mac Minister's girlfriend.
Prosecutors detail that police lifted a fingerprint from the car after the shooting. It was a perfect match for Mac Minister.
Maybe he leaned inside and touched something at the scene. Or maybe it was there before it happened. But the fact that he's connected to that car seemed to undermine the idea that he could be innocent.
The prosecution presents video footage from the Las Vegas hotel where Fat Tone and Cowboy were staying, which shows them with Mac Minister before the shooting.
There are a bunch of people coming in and out on the night they were killed. One of them is Mac Minister, and he's with his girlfriend. They leave with Fat Tone and Cowboy around 11:30 p.m.
A key witness testifies he had a conversation with Mac Minister about the murders on December 5, 2005 in Las Vegas, while the rapper was on the run from police.
He claimed that he ran into Mr. Dow. He said to Mr. Dow, "Why are you out in public? They're looking for you." He claimed that Mr. Dow stated something to the effect of, "I'm not worried about that, and if anyone has a problem, they'll end up missing like that woman, Miss Larson."
But the defense insists the case against Mac Minister is purely circumstantial. Prosecutors don't have physical proof he was involved in the shootings.
Mathis is the one who owned the AK-47, and he's the one whose prints were on the magazine of bullets like the ones that were used at the shooting. However, they don't have anything definitive on Dow.
The footage in the parking garage cuts out before it shows everybody getting in the same car, and Mr. Dow's position was always that he did not leave the scene with these people. There was evidence that during this time, Mr. Dow would let Fat Tone drive his vehicle while he was in town in Las Vegas. Basically, he was trying to help him in the music industry. So there was really no evidence whatsoever other than pure speculation that somehow Mr. Dow was trying to avenge the murder of Mac Dre.
Mac Minister had no reason to, he knew Dre, but he wasn't a close friend to Dre where he felt like, well, I gotta go kill Fat Tone. I could see where people would try to connect it, but that's a far reach to call that a retaliation killing for Mac Dre. Why would he do that?
After a week-long trial, Mac Minister's fate now rests in the hands of the jury. Despite the prosecution's attempts to connect him to the murders of Fat Tone and Cowboy, Mac Minister's attorneys believe his innocence is clear.
The defense told the jury there are two ways police can investigate a crime. One is to collect all of the evidence, study it, and then find a suspect that best matches it. The other is to pick a suspect, decide he's guilty, then come up with the evidence to prove it. According to him, it was clear which one of those things happened in this case.
Mac Minister, he had no motive. He had no real motive to go set up Fat Tone and kill Fat Tone. I really believe he got a bad break out of this situation.
The jury disagrees. On July 31st, 2008, they find Andre Mac Minister Dow guilty of murder. He's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In a separate trial, his alleged co-conspirator, Jason Mathis, is also convicted and receives the same sentence.
Mac Minister currently in a Las Vegas prison, and he is appealing his arrest. He's always maintained his innocence.
I was contacted by Mr. Dow and was informed about some of the legal issues in his case. And so that is what we're challenging now. We believe that Mr. Dow is factually innocent and is actually innocent.
One of the things that made Mac Minister look so guilty was the album he produced from jail.
When we think about rappers being involved in crimes and even their lyrics being used to create a profile of them, what we have learned is that's a violation of their First Amendment rights.
In 2022, Mac Minister's conviction is thrown into doubt when one of the key witnesses for the prosecution reveals the conversation he claimed to have had with Mac Minister about the murders never happened.
He's recanted that entire statement. He's admitted he lied at trial. He was in jail in Georgia, specifically Fulton County, Georgia, on December 5th, 2005. So therefore, it was impossible that Mr. Dow could have had this conversation with him. And so this entire case is an injustice on many levels, and it's based on speculation, it's based on incomplete evidence, and really is based now on false evidence.
Much like the Mac Dre murder and the Fat Tone rumors that followed, to me, it wasn't clear that Mac Minister actually was the person that killed Fat Tone.
While some feel Mac Minister was wrongly convicted, others believe he's right where he belongs. As for the murders of Lee Larson and Mac Dre, those cases remain unsolved.
It's terrible, because we really didn't get no answers. So we got to just go with the stories of what we hear.
This case will remain open, and it will remain open until justice for Mac Dre and his family can be had.
Mac Dre's death may be shrouded in mystery, but his legacy in rap music continues to endure.
So when we think about Mac Dre, it's his energy, it's his joy, it's his unbridled release of fun that will live on forever. That still lives on. We still getting hypey, we still going dumb.
We created this image.
The Arctic can keep a secret longer than almost any place on Earth. It can bury a trail beneath a single night of drifting snow. It can erase footprints before dawn. It can swallow a body beneath ice, carry blood into frozen ground, and leave nothing behind except silence. In November of 1913, somewhere near the mouth of the Coppermine River in the Canadian Arctic, That silence closed around 4 men. 2 of them were Catholic missionaries. 2 of them were Inuit guides. Only 2 would walk away alive. What happened in those final hours would eventually become one of the strangest and most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. But the deeper the story went, the harder it became to answer the most basic question of all. Who were the killers? And who, in that frozen wilderness, had truly been afraid for their lives? The wind moved across the snow without meeting a single wall to stop it. There were no streets, no houses, no church bells, no police station within walking distance, no telephone line running across the white emptiness. Nothing but a vast, hostile world of frozen land and black water, stretching farther than the human eye could follow. In that landscape, survival was knowledge. Knowledge of the wind, knowledge of the ice, knowledge of how far a person could travel before exhaustion turned into death. The 2 Catholic priests knew faith. The 2 Inuit men knew the land. And somewhere between those 2 kinds of knowledge, something broke. By the time the journey was over, Father Jean-Baptiste Rouvière and Father Guillaume Leroux were dead. One had been shot. The other had been attacked with a blade and an axe. Their bodies were left behind in the Arctic wilderness. The men accused of killing them were named Sinisiak and Uliksuk. And years later, when the case finally reached a courtroom thousands of kilometers away from the place where the blood had been spilled, the story would become even stranger. Because one of the accused would first be found not guilty. Then after that, both men would face another trial. Both would be convicted. Both would be sentenced to die. And then neither would be executed. Sounds impossible. A contradiction inside a courtroom. A story in which a man could walk free from one murder trial, only to find himself standing before another jury for the death of the second victim. But this was not an ordinary crime. The case of Sinisiak and Uliksuk was born in a place where the laws of the Canadian courts had barely touched the people who lived there. The Arctic was not simply a distant corner of the country. For many of the men sent north by the government, by the church, and by other institutions of southern Canada, it was a frontier still waiting to be mapped, governed, and controlled. For the Inuit who had lived there for generations, it was home. And that difference would matter. It would matter on the trail. It would matter at the moment violence began. And it would matter years later, when 2 Inuit men were removed from their homeland and brought south to face judges, lawyers, juries, and a legal system that spoke a language not their own. But before there were courtrooms, there was snow. Before there were verdicts, there was fear. And before the Canadian government could decide what justice looked like. For men were traveling together through one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Imagine the last journey. The air is sharp enough to hurt when it enters the lungs. Every breath hangs briefly in front of the face before the wind tears it apart. The ground is hard and white. The horizon seems endless. A man cannot simply turn around and walk away from an argument here. There is nowhere to walk to. A disagreement between traveling companions can become more dangerous with every passing mile, because each person depends on the others for movement, food, equipment, and survival. Out there, a broken relationship can be as dangerous as a broken leg. And according to the accounts that would later emerge, the relationship between the priests and the 2 Inuit men had become increasingly tense. Sinisiak and Uliksuk had been helping the missionaries travel through the Arctic. They knew the terrain. They knew what the southern visitors did not. Their labor and their experience were essential. But the journey was not going well. Promises had been made about payment. There were expectations involving goods and equipment. There were differences in language, culture, and authority. And then there was the personality of Father Leroux, later described as impatient and quick-tempered. In another place, those tensions might have ended with an argument and a slammed door. In the Arctic, there were no doors. There was only the trail ahead. Day after day, the men continued together. Perhaps that was what made the danger so difficult to escape. A person can endure an uncomfortable conversation. He can tolerate anger. He can look away. But when he must sleep beside the same people, travel with them, depend on them, and trust them with his life, every gesture can begin to carry meaning. A raised voice is no longer just a raised voice. A hand reaching toward a weapon is no longer just a movement. A moment of silence can begin to feel like a warning. Years later, Uliksuk would describe being frightened. In his account, He wanted to speak but was prevented from doing so. He would also describe seeing a gun directed toward the two Inuit men. Was it a threat? Was it an attempt to control a dangerous situation? Was it misunderstood? Or had the men reached a point where fear had already changed the way they interpreted everything they saw? And perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. There is no simple villain standing alone at the center of the story. There is no easy line separating innocence from guilt, fear from aggression, or self-preservation from murder. What we know is this. At some point during that journey, Sinisiak and Uliksuk became convinced that they were in danger. Not vague danger. Not the ordinary fear of a difficult expedition. They came to believe that if they did not act first, the white men traveling with them might kill them. And once a person believes death is coming, the world can change in a single second. The hand that moves toward a weapon becomes the hand of an executioner. The face of a traveling companion becomes the face of an enemy. A decision that might once have seemed unthinkable begins to look like survival. Then came the violence. The details are fragmented by time, by translation, by testimony, and by the enormous distance between the event and the courtroom where it would later be reconstructed. But 2 men died. Father Riviere was killed. Father Leroux was killed. The missionaries who had entered the Arctic to bring their faith to a distant people would never return from the journey. And Sinisiak and Uliksuk survived. For a time the Arctic kept the secret. There were no flashing police lights on the horizon. No detectives sealing off the scene with yellow tape. No forensic team measuring bloodstains. No immediate witness interviews recorded in a police station. The bodies remained in a remote wilderness. The news of the deaths did not instantly travel south. Time passed. Snow fell. The landscape continued to do what it had always done. Covered things. But eventually questions began to spread. Where were the priests? Why had they not returned? And then objects connected to the dead men began appearing in places where they should not have been. Weapons. Equipment. Possessions. Small pieces of evidence, moving through a world where almost everything had to be carried by hand. The investigation that followed would face obstacles almost impossible to imagine in a modern murder case. There was no DNA. No surveillance footage. No rapid communication between distant communities. The investigators had to cross enormous distances through the Arctic, relying on travel routes, local knowledge, stories, and physical objects that might connect one person to another. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police would eventually trace the case to Sinisiak and Uliksuk. But even that was not the end of the mystery, because finding the men was one thing. Understanding what had happened was another. By the time they were arrested in the spring of 1916, more than 2 years had passed since the killings. 2 years. In a modern investigation, 2 years can be an eternity. In the Arctic of 1913, it was almost another world. Memories changed. Stories were repeated. Names and details moved through different languages. And the 2 accused men now faced investigators representing a government whose system of law had not shaped the world in which they had grown up. When Sinisiak and Uliksuk finally gave their accounts, they did not deny that the priests had died at their hands. That was not the heart of the mystery. The heart of the mystery was why. Did they kill for the missionaries' possessions? Did they want their guns, their ammunition, and their equipment? Or had they reached a moment of genuine terror, convinced that the men traveling beside them were preparing to kill them? That question would split the story in two. And it would eventually split the outcome of the trials as well. There is something almost cinematic about the image of these men being taken away from the Arctic. Imagine what that journey must have felt like. A world of snow and open sky disappearing behind them. Then travel south. Farther south. Into places where the buildings stood close together. Where streets replaced trails. Where strangers spoke a language of laws, procedures, charges, and punishments. Sinisiak and Uliksuk were not simply being taken to court. They were being taken into another civilization's idea of what justice meant. And in 1917 that process began. The first trial focused on Sinisiak and the death of Father Riviere. The courtroom was a world away from the place where the killing had occurred. There, the Arctic had to be rebuilt through words. Witnesses described events. Lawyers argued about fear and intention. A jury tried to look backward through years of silence and decide what had happened in a place none of them had seen. And then came a stunning result. Sinisiak was found not guilty. For a brief moment it seemed the story might be over. But it was not. Because there was another dead priest. Another killing. Another courtroom. And this time the stakes were even higher. The second trial brought both Sinisiak and Uliksuk before the justice system. What happened there was not merely about 2 deaths in the snow. There was another question moving beneath the surface. A question about the power of Canada in the Arctic. How far did the government's law reach? Could 2 Inuit men, living according to a world of knowledge and traditions that had existed long before Canadian courts appeared in the region, be judged by a legal system they had never chosen? And if they were judged, what message would the government send after the verdict? That question is one of the darkest shadows hanging over this case. Because the trial was not taking place in a political vacuum. The Arctic mattered. Control of the Arctic mattered. And the law could be more than a tool for punishing a crime. Could also be a flag. A declaration. A way of saying, this land and the people living on it now exist beneath our authority. In the courtroom, the 2 men were convicted of murder. The jury took only about 46 minutes to reach its decision. Then came the sentence. Death by hanging. For Sinisiak. For Uliksuk. The Arctic journey that had begun with 4 men traveling through the snow had now led to 2 men standing beneath the machinery of the state, waiting to learn whether they would live or die. But even then, the story refused to follow a straight line. The death sentences were commuted. The men would not be hanged. Instead, they were given life sentences. And yet even that would not mean spending the rest of their lives behind prison walls in the way we might imagine today. Their imprisonment would become another strange chapter in a case filled with contradictions. They would eventually work under conditions of minimal security, assist police activities, and years later be allowed to return to their communities. What then are we supposed to call this story? A murder? A tragedy? An act of self-defense that became an act of violence? A collision between cultures? A failed expedition? A political trial? The answer may be all of those things. That is why the case of Sinisiak and Uliksuk cannot be understood by beginning with the courtroom. We have to go back. Back before the arrest. Back before the bodies were found. Back before the investigators began asking questions. We have to return to the beginning of the journey, when 2 Catholic missionaries traveled into the world of the Copper Inuit. Back to a place where a priest's cross could mean faith to one man and an unfamiliar power to another. Back to a trail where trust was beginning to disappear. Back to the long white silence of the Arctic. Because before anyone was called a murderer, before anyone was called a victim, 4 men were alive. They walked beneath the same sky. They faced the same cold. They depended on the same fragile supplies. And perhaps in those final days, each side began looking at the other and wondering a question that would become fatal. Can I trust you with my life? In the end, 2 men answered that question with violence. 2 others never returned home. And years later, when the courts finally tried to decide what justice required, they discovered something that investigators often learn too late. The hardest cases are not always the ones with no evidence. Sometimes the hardest cases are the ones where everyone agrees on what happened but no one can agree on what it meant. This is the story of Sinisiak and Uliksuk. A story buried beneath Arctic snow. A story of fear, faith, violence, and power. And a story in which the most chilling question may not be who killed the 2 priests. It may be this. When 2 worlds collide in the middle of nowhere, whose version of justice gets to decide what happened? For more than 2 years, the Arctic held its silence. Somewhere beyond the familiar roads and settlements of southern Canada, beyond the reach of quick communication and immediate investigation, 2 Catholic priests had disappeared into a world of snow, ice, wind, and distance. No one could call for help. No one could send a message across the wilderness and expect an answer by morning. There was no flashing light cutting through the darkness. No detective arriving at the scene. No doctor examining the dead within hours. There was only the Arctic. And the Arctic was very good at making human beings disappear. Father Jean-Baptiste Rivière and Father Guillaume Leroux had entered that frozen world with a mission. They were men of faith, traveling into the territory of the Copper Inuit, carrying with them the beliefs and authority of the Catholic Church. They had come north to reach people who lived in a world profoundly different from the one they knew. But in the end, the journey that was supposed to bring two worlds together would tear them apart. By the time the truth began to emerge, the two priests were dead, and the men who had traveled beside them were alive. Sinisiak, Uliksuk. Two names that would eventually cross the enormous distance from the Arctic wilderness to the courtrooms of southern Canada. Two men who would be called murderers. Two men who would admit that violence had taken place. And two men who would insist, in one form or another, that fear had entered the story before blood did. That is where this case becomes difficult. Because murder investigations often begin with a simple division. The dead on one side, the accused on the other. Victim. Killer. Innocent. Guilty. But the further we step into the story of Sinisiak and Uliksuk, the more those words begin to lose their simplicity. The priests were dead. That was undeniable. Their deaths were violent. That was undeniable too. But why had they died? What had happened during the final journey? What had been said? Who had become afraid first? And in the middle of that vast, frozen land, when four men had been traveling together with no independent witnesses standing nearby, who could truly reconstruct the exact moment when fear became violence? Perhaps the most frightening part of this case is that the answer would never be found at a single crime scene. There was no perfect reconstruction, no camera recording the final confrontation, no modern forensic laboratory capable of pulling the past out of a few drops of blood. Instead, there were bodies, there were weapons, there were possessions, and there were stories. Stories told after time had passed. Stories moving through different languages. Stories interpreted by people who had not been present when the violence began. The Arctic did not explain what happened. It simply kept the evidence cold. And while the dead men could no longer speak, the two survivors could. That made their words enormously important. But it also made them dangerous. Because a story can change depending on who is listening. Imagine standing in a courtroom in southern Canada and trying to explain a moment of terror that took place years earlier in the middle of the Arctic. How do you explain the cold? How do you explain the isolation? How do you explain what it means to be hundreds of kilometers from any place of safety? How do you explain the relationship between a gun and fear when you have spent your entire life understanding that, in the wilderness, a weapon can mean food, protection, authority, or death? And how do you explain that to men who were sitting in warm rooms, wearing formal clothing surrounded by walls, laws, and institutions? That was the distance at the heart of this case. Not just the distance between the Arctic and Edmonton. Not just the distance between the Arctic and Calgary. But the distance between experiences. The law would later try to reduce everything to a series of questions. Did they kill the priests? Yes or no? Did they intend to kill them? Yes or no? Were they afraid? Yes or no? But human fear rarely works in such clean categories. A man can be afraid and violent at the same time. A man can believe he is in danger and still make a terrible decision. A man can act to save himself and yet destroy someone else's life forever. And sometimes, two groups of people can enter the same journey with completely different ideas about power. That was the danger waiting beneath the surface when the missionaries and the Inuit men traveled together. The priests carried the authority of the church. They were educated men from another world, representatives of an institution that believed it had come to bring spiritual truth to people who did not share its beliefs. Sinisiak and Uliksuk carried something different. They carried knowledge that could not be learned in a classroom. They knew the land. They knew the routes. They understood the weather. They knew how quickly a journey could turn deadly. They knew that the Arctic did not care about titles. A priest could freeze just as easily as anyone else. A man with education could starve if he did not understand the land. A traveler with authority could become completely dependent on the person walking beside him. That dependence can create tension, especially when one side still believes it has the right to command the other. The missionaries needed the Inuit men. But needing someone's knowledge is not the same as respecting the person who possesses it. And respect during that journey appears to have been disappearing. There were disputes. There were disagreements about work and payment. There were growing tensions between the men. According to later accounts, Father LaRue could be impatient and quick-tempered. Perhaps at first the argument seemed small. A disagreement over equipment. A disagreement over where to travel. A disagreement over what had been promised. The kind of conflict that might begin with a raised voice and then fade away after everyone has had time to cool down. But the Arctic does not always give people time. When four men travel together through an empty wilderness, an argument cannot simply be left behind at the end of the day. Everyone must continue. Everyone must sleep. Everyone must wake up and move forward with the same people. The tension travels with them. It sits beside them. It enters the camp at night. And slowly, almost invisibly, the meaning of every gesture can begin to change. A look becomes suspicious. A silence becomes threatening. A hand near a weapon becomes impossible to ignore. For Sinisiak and Uliksuk, that transformation appears to have become deadly. At some point they believed the priests were going to kill them. The exact path to that belief is still wrapped in the uncertainties of the case. But the fear itself would become central to everything that followed. One of the most important questions in the trials would be whether this fear was reasonable. Had the missionaries actually threatened them? Had Father LaRue pointed a gun at them? Had something been said or done that convinced the Inuit men they were in immediate danger? Or had mistrust grown so deep that the two sides were no longer seeing the same reality? Imagine that final confrontation. For men in the cold, the open wilderness around them. No witnesses. No one coming. No one standing far enough away to later say, "I saw who started it." One moment they are traveling companions. The next something changes. Perhaps a weapon is moved. Perhaps someone shouts. Perhaps one man steps forward while another steps back. And in that instant, the difference between suspicion and certainty disappears. Fear does not always wait for proof. Sometimes fear decides that proof has already arrived. Then the first act of violence is committed. And after that, there is no return. A gunshot in the Arctic is not like a gunshot in a city. There is no immediate chaos of car horns, screaming crowds, or footsteps running toward the sound. The noise tears through the cold air. Then it dies. The wilderness remains. The silence comes back. But something is now lying in the snow. Someone is no longer moving. Father Riviere was dead. The journey had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Then came the death of Father LaRue. The violence was not a single accident. It did not end after one man fell. Another priest died. Another human life disappeared into the Arctic silence. Later accounts would describe brutal injuries. A shooting. A stabbing. An axe. The details were horrifying enough to make the case seem simple to anyone hearing them for the first time. 2 men had been killed. 2 other men had survived. What more was there to understand? But the more investigators and later juries examined the story, the more complicated that question became. Because brutality does not automatically explain motive. A violent death can come from hatred, from greed, from revenge, from panic, from fear, or from several of those things at once. The human mind does not always offer investigators a clean answer. And in this case, the explanation given by Sinisiak and Uliksuk would force the courts to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the men who committed the killings genuinely believed they were preventing their own deaths? That does not erase the dead. It does not bring the priests back. It does not remove responsibility. But it changes the question. And once the question changes, the meaning of justice can change with it. After the killings, the 2 Inuit men took property belonging to the missionaries. Weapons, ammunition, other useful possessions. To prosecutors, that could look like motive. Perhaps the killings had been committed to obtain those things. In a world where firearms and supplies had enormous practical value, the possibility could not simply be ignored. But for the defense, the same facts could be interpreted differently. If the men had believed their own lives were in danger, taking weapons and equipment after the confrontation could have been part of survival. Again, the case divided into 2 possible stories. In one story, Sinisiak and Uliksuk were opportunistic killers. They murdered 2 priests and took what they wanted. In the other story, 2 frightened men were trapped in a deadly confrontation, struck first, and then survived using whatever remained. The truth might have existed somewhere between those extremes. Or perhaps it was closer to one than the other. But by then, only 2 of the 4 men could tell the story. And that is one of the oldest problems in criminal justice. When violence leaves only one side alive, the survivors often become the authors of the final account. The dead cannot correct them. The dead cannot point to a different moment and say, "No, that is not how it happened." The dead cannot explain what they meant. They cannot deny an accusation. They cannot reveal their fear. They can only become evidence. And evidence is interpreted by the living. The bodies of the 2 missionaries were eventually part of a story that would travel south. The weapons became part of that story. The missing men became part of it. The possessions that changed hands became part of it. Slowly, the silence of the Arctic began to break. But it broke in fragments. A rumor. An object. A question. A person noticing something that did not belong where it had been found. And with each fragment, the fate of the 2 priests became harder to ignore. The authorities began looking north. This was not a simple investigation. The very act of investigating required extraordinary effort. The distance itself became an obstacle. Investigators could not simply get into a vehicle and arrive at the scene by nightfall. They had to travel through territory where the land itself could decide whether a journey continued. They depended on routes, on weather, on transportation, on people who knew the region. And as they moved through that world, the case began to take shape. The priests were gone. Their belongings had not disappeared with them. And eventually suspicion narrowed. It led toward the 2 men who had been traveling with them, Sinisiak, Uliksuk. By the time the arrest came in 1916, the killings were already part of the past. More than 2 years had passed. But the past was about to become very present again. For Sinisiak and Uliksuk, the arrest was not the final consequence of what happened. It was the beginning of another journey, perhaps an even stranger one. They would leave the world they knew and enter the machinery of the Canadian justice system. There, the Arctic would be translated into testimony. Fear would be translated into legal argument. Violence would be translated into charges. And 2 men who had lived their lives far from southern courtrooms would discover that another group of people now had the power to decide whether they deserved to die. The transformation was almost surreal. In the Arctic, the question had been survival. In court, the question would become guilt. But the 2 questions were not entirely separate. That was what made the case so powerful. If Sinisiak and Uliksuk had truly believed they were about to be killed, then the meaning of their actions had to be examined differently. If they had not believed that, or if their fear was merely an excuse created afterward, then 2 priests had been murdered in cold blood. The difference between those possibilities was enormous. It was the difference between self-preservation and murder, between acquittal and execution. And eventually, the courts would come to 2 dramatically different conclusions. The first trial would produce a verdict that shocked many observers. Sinisiak was acquitted. For one moment, it seemed possible that the legal system had accepted the idea that fear, circumstance, and the behavior of the missionaries had created a situation in which his actions could not be treated as ordinary murder. But the story was not finished. There were still 2 dead men. There was still another charge. And there was also another concern moving quietly through the halls of government. Canada was looking north. The Arctic was not merely empty wilderness on a map. It was territory. Territory meant sovereignty. Sovereignty required presence. And presence required authority. What better symbol of authority than law? A police uniform. A courtroom. A judge. A sentence. The state could reach into the most distant parts of the country and declare that its rules applied there too. This is where the story of Sinisiak and Uliksuk becomes larger than the deaths of 2 missionaries. The trial became part of a much broader collision. A legal system was extending itself over a people with their own customs, knowledge, and ways of understanding the world. The 2 accused men were no longer only individuals standing before the court. Whether they wanted it or not, they became symbols. Their case could send a message to other Inuit communities, a message to government officials, a message about who had the authority to define crime, and perhaps most importantly, a message about who had the authority to define justice. The second trial would be very different. This time, both Sinisiak and Uliksuk stood accused. This time the outcome would be conviction. The jury would deliberate for less than an hour. 46 minutes. Think about that. Years had passed since the killings. The men had traveled thousands of kilometers. The case had crossed languages, cultures, landscapes, and legal systems. And after all of that, 46 minutes would help determine whether two human beings lived or died. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. Hanging. For a moment, the machinery of justice appeared complete. A crime had been committed. The accused had been found guilty. The punishment required by law had been pronounced. But once again, the story refused to end where it was supposed to end. The men were not executed. Their sentences were commuted. They were sent into custody instead. And eventually, in another twist almost impossible to imagine in a conventional murder case, they would assist the very authorities who had arrested them. Years later, they would return home. One of them, Uliksuk, would eventually die in 1929 after years of illness and hardship. But the story he left behind would continue to trouble historians, legal scholars, and anyone who asks what happens when the law enters a world it does not fully understand. Because perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether Sinisiak and Uliksuk killed the priests. They did. The deeper mystery is what happened in the moments before the killings. What did the priests intend? What did the Inuit men see? What did they hear? What did they believe? And what does fear look like when it is examined years later by people who were never there? That is the problem we are about to enter. A case where the snow covered the ground but could not bury the questions. A case where two dead missionaries became the center of a national legal drama. A case where two Inuit men were condemned to die, only to be spared. And a case where the final verdict may tell us as much about the ambitions of a country as it does about the deaths of two men. To understand what really happened, we have to slow down. We have to leave the courtroom behind. We have to leave the headlines and the verdicts behind. We have to travel north. Far north. To the edge of the known world as many Southern Canadians imagined it at the beginning of the 20th century. To a land where the wind can erase a trail overnight. To communities that had survived for generations through knowledge passed from one person to another. To the world of the Copper Inuit. Because before the violence, before the fear, before the accusations, two strangers came into that world carrying a mission. They came with faith. They came with purpose. They came believing they had something to offer. But in the frozen distance ahead, another story was already beginning to take shape. A story that would leave two men dead. Two men accused. And an entire legal system struggling to decide what justice was supposed to mean. The snow was still falling. The wind was still moving across the land. And somewhere ahead, four men were beginning a journey together. None of them knew that history would remember them. None of them knew that their names would one day be spoken inside courtrooms. None of them knew that a few weeks, a few arguments, and a few moments of fear would eventually become a criminal case unlike any other. For now they were simply moving forward. Step by step. Across the ice. Into the white silence. Toward the moment when two worlds would collide. And once they did, no one would come out unchanged. Years later, people would look at the case and ask a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How could the same story lead to such different outcomes? How could one of the accused be found not guilty in one courtroom, and then later stand beside the other accused as both men were convicted of murder? How could two men be sentenced to death and then allowed to live? And perhaps most importantly, how could a case involving two brutally killed priests become a symbol of something much larger than murder? The answer begins with a simple fact. The place where the killings happened was not just remote. It was isolated from the entire world that would later judge what happened there. When Father Jean-Baptiste Rouvière and Father Guillaume Leroux died, there was no judge standing nearby. No jury. No prosecutor. No newspaper reporter taking notes. No government official ready to define the meaning of the blood on the snow. There were only the people who had been there. And after the violence ended, Only 2 of those people remained alive. That is why the story of Sinisiak and Uliksuk begins with a terrible imbalance. The dead could no longer tell their side. The survivors could. And everyone who came later had to decide whether to believe them. But even belief was not a simple matter. Imagine hearing a man describe the moment he became convinced that he was going to die. Imagine that he speaks through translation. Imagine that his memories are being questioned years after the event. Imagine that the people judging him have never traveled through the place where the confrontation happened. They have never stood in that exact cold. They have never depended on the same fragile equipment. They have never been forced to decide whether the person beside them is still a traveling companion or has become a threat. How do you measure fear in a courtroom? You cannot place it on a table as evidence. You cannot weigh it. You cannot photograph it. And yet fear can make a human being do something irreversible. That was the invisible force at the center of this case. The 2 missionaries were dead. Their bodies could show wounds. Their possessions could be identified. Weapons could be examined. But fear left no physical mark. It existed only inside the minds of the men who survived. And those minds would soon become the battlefield of the entire case. Sinisiak and Uliksuk were not strangers who had simply appeared from the darkness to attack the priests. They had traveled with them. They had worked with them. They had shared the same difficult journey through the Arctic. For some time, the 4 men had been bound together by necessity. That is important, because the most dangerous violence is not always committed between strangers. Sometimes it grows inside relationships that were once based on cooperation. One argument is tolerated. Then another. One insult is remembered. Promise is questioned. A voice becomes louder. Someone begins to feel humiliated. Someone else begins to feel threatened. And eventually, every new conflict arrives carrying the weight of all the ones that came before it. The past begins to stand inside the room with the people, even when the room is the open Arctic. By the final stage of the journey, trust appears to have become dangerously thin. The priests had their expectations. The Inuit men had theirs. The missionaries had come from a culture with its own ideas about hierarchy and authority. The Copper Inuit had their own knowledge of the land, their own customs, and their own ways of surviving in a region where ignorance could kill. Those differences were not academic. They mattered every day. Who decided where to travel? Who decided when to stop? Who controlled the equipment? Who held the weapons? Who believed they had the authority to give orders? And who believed those orders could no longer be trusted? Somewhere in the answers to those questions, the journey began to unravel. Later, Uliksuk would describe a frightening encounter involving Father Leroux and a gun. He would say that he had wanted to speak but was prevented from doing so. He would describe a weapon being directed toward the 2 Inuit men. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as remembered would become part of the difficulty surrounding the case. But one thing is clear. The account placed fear at the center of the confrontation. And fear is contagious. Once one person becomes convinced that danger is immediate, his actions can influence everyone around him. A hand moves. Someone reaches for a weapon. Another person sees that movement and reacts. Within seconds, the original intention may no longer matter. The reaction has already taken over. That is the terrible speed of violent encounters. They may take years to build, but only seconds to destroy lives. In the Arctic, there was no one to separate the men. No officer arriving between them. No neighbor hearing the argument. No door to close between one person and another. The wilderness offered enormous space, but it did not always offer escape. The 4 men were traveling together. Their supplies, their route, and their survival were connected. And when that connection broke, the consequences were immediate. Then came the moment that history cannot replay. The moment no camera captured. The moment that would later be rebuilt from fragments. One of the priests fell. Then the other. When the violence ended, the Arctic was once again silent. That silence must have been unbearable. A few moments earlier, there had been 4 living men. Now there were 2. 2 bodies remained. 2 survivors stood in the snow. There are moments after violence when the human mind seems to slow down. The danger is over, but the body does not know that yet. The heart continues to race. Hands tremble. The cold suddenly feels different. The world looks unchanged, which somehow makes everything worse. The same snow. The same sky. The same wind. But nothing is the same anymore. For Sinisiak and Uliksuk, whatever they believed before the confrontation, they now had to live with what they had done. And survival in the Arctic did not pause for guilt. Food was still needed. Shelter was still needed. Weapons and equipment still mattered. The dead men could no longer use the things they had carried. The living could. Some of those possessions were taken. Later, those objects would become important pieces of the investigation. But at that moment, in the middle of the wilderness, an object could have several meanings. Could be evidence. Could be property. Could be survival. The difficulty of the case was that those meanings would collide. To a future prosecutor, taking the priest's belongings could support an argument of robbery and murder. To the accused, the same action could be connected to what happened after a deadly confrontation. And this is where the investigation would face one of its greatest challenges. Evidence does not speak by itself. People give evidence a story. A gun found in someone's possession can mean theft, can mean protection, can mean survival. A witness can look at the same object and see guilt. Another can see necessity. The object remains the same. The meaning changes. That is why the truth of a criminal case is often more fragile than people realize. Facts are not always disputed. Interpretation is. The priests were dead. That was a fact. Sinisiak and Uliksuk had survived. That was a fact. The men had possessed property connected to the priests. That was a fact. But the meaning of those facts would eventually determine whether two human beings lived or died. And in this case, the meaning would not be decided in the Arctic. It would be decided far away. For more than 2 years, the wilderness remained between the killings and the law. The priest's disappearance did not instantly become a murder investigation in the modern sense. There was distance. There was delay. There were difficulties of travel and communication. The Arctic itself created time. And time can change a case. The longer an investigation takes to begin, the more memories are tested. People forget. Stories become repeated. Details become sharpened or softened. The people who were not present begin to form opinions. By the time the authorities moved toward Sinisiak and Uliksuk, the original moment of violence had already become something that existed partly in memory. The police had to reconstruct the past from what remained. Imagine the frustration. A murder investigation where the scene lies in a region so remote that reaching it is an expedition of its own. A case where witnesses may be separated by enormous distances. A case involving language barriers. A case where the accused come from a cultural world that the investigators may not fully understand. And yet the police had a responsibility. 2 men were dead. Someone had to answer for it. Eventually the investigation narrowed. The trail led toward the 2 Inuit men who had traveled with the missionaries. In the spring of 1916, Sinisiak and Uliksuk were arrested. By then, the killings were no longer an immediate event. They were history. But for the accused, history had suddenly come back to life. The past was no longer buried in snow. It had put handcuffs on them. From that point forward, they entered a process built on rules that had not shaped the circumstances of the original confrontation. There would be charges, statements, legal arguments, translation, courtrooms, judges, juries, and eventually the possibility of the death penalty. For 2 men whose lives had been rooted in the Arctic, the journey south must have felt like entering a foreign world. The land itself changed. The horizon changed. The way people lived changed. The buildings grew larger. The rooms became warmer. The streets became crowded. And somewhere ahead waited a courtroom where strangers would listen to their story and decide what it meant. This is where the case becomes almost surreal. Because in the Arctic, the men had been judged by the environment. Make the wrong decision and the land could kill you. In the courtroom, they would be judged by people. Make the wrong impression and the state could kill you. The first major legal test came in 1917. Sinisiak was tried for the death of Father Rouvier. The courtroom was far removed from the place where the killing happened, But the Arctic had to be brought inside through testimony. Lawyers would attempt to recreate a world of snow and fear using nothing more than language. They would discuss the relationship between the men, the threats, the weapons, the circumstances. And eventually the jury had to decide, was Sinisiak a murderer? Or had the circumstances been so extraordinary that the prosecution had failed to prove criminal guilt? The verdict came, not guilty. For Sinisiak, it was an extraordinary moment. A man accused of killing a Catholic priest in one of the most remote parts of Canada had stood before a Southern jury and walked away without a murder conviction. But freedom would not last, because the law had another path available. There was still a second priest. There was still a second death. And Sinisiak was not alone in that story. Uliksuk would now stand beside him. The second trial would be different in more ways than one. By this point, the case had become impossible to separate completely from the broader presence of the Canadian state in the Arctic. The government was not merely investigating an isolated act of violence. It was demonstrating reach. The message was implicit but powerful. No place was too distant. No community was beyond the law. No killing could be considered outside the authority of the state simply because it happened thousands of kilometers from the nearest major city. But that principle created another question. If the law reached everywhere, did understanding reach everywhere too? Could a courtroom truly understand the people it was judging? Could a legal system built in the South fully measure fear in the North? Could 12 people who had never faced the same circumstances decide what a reasonable person should have done in that frozen moment? Those questions hung over the case, whether spoken aloud or not. And when the second jury finally received the case, the decision came quickly. 46 minutes. Less than an hour to decide the fate of two men whose story had begun years earlier on the Arctic Trail. The verdict was guilty. Then came the sentence that changed the air inside the courtroom. Death. The law of the time prescribed execution for murder. Sinisiak and Uliksuk were condemned to be hanged. For a moment, it appeared that the story would end with the state doing what the Arctic had not, taking the lives of the two surviving men. But even that ending did not come. The death sentences were commuted. The men would live. And the contradiction at the heart of the case became even deeper. They had been condemned as murderers. Yet mercy was recommended. They had been sentenced to die. Yet the state spared them. They were given life sentences. Yet they would eventually return to their communities. The more closely we look at the case, the less it resembles a straight line. It is a maze. At every turn, certainty disappears. And perhaps that is exactly why the story remains so powerful. The killings themselves were terrible. Two men died violently in the Arctic. Nothing about the complexity of the case should erase that fact. Father Rouvier and Father Leroux left behind lives that ended far from home. They were not simply names in a legal record. They were human beings who had traveled north with purpose and never returned. Their deaths mattered. Their final moments mattered. But the accused were human beings too. They were not characters invented to play the role of villains in someone else's story. They had families. They had communities. They had lives rooted in a land the courts would later treat as part of a legal frontier. And somewhere between the deaths of the priests and the convictions of the Inuit men, the case became a warning about the danger of simple narratives. The easiest version of the story is this. Two Inuit men killed two priests. They were arrested. They were tried. They were punished. But that version leaves too much in the darkness. It does not explain the fear. It does not explain the tension. It does not explain the first acquittal. It does not explain why the prosecution continued. It does not explain the political meaning attached to the second trial. And it does not explain why the men, after being sentenced to death, were later spared and eventually allowed to return home. The real story is more uncomfortable. It forces us to sit with uncertainty. Perhaps the priests felt afraid too. Perhaps they believed they were losing control of the situation. Perhaps they did not understand how their words and actions were being interpreted. Perhaps Sinisiak and Uliksuk misunderstood them. Perhaps the Inuit men correctly sensed danger. Perhaps fear on both sides fed the violence until neither group could see a peaceful way out. We cannot place ourselves in that exact moment. We cannot know every thought that passed through the minds of the four men. But we can understand one thing. Once violence began, everyone lost something. The priests lost their lives. Sinisiak and Uliksuk lost their freedom. Their families lost them to the justice system. And the story itself lost the possibility of ever having four voices. Only two remained. That is why the next step in this journey matters so much. We are going to go back before the blood, before the bodies, before the arrests, before the courtroom. We are going to enter the world in which this tragedy became possible. A world that southern Canada often imagined as empty, even though people had lived there for generations. A world of frozen rivers and shifting ice. Of hunting, travel, family, memory, and survival. A world where knowledge was carried not in libraries but in experience. And into that world came missionaries. Men with faith. Men with a mission. Men who believed they were traveling toward the unknown. But the unknown was already someone's home. That is where the Real story begins. Not with the first shot. Not with the first blow. But with two worlds moving toward each other across the Arctic. One carried a cross. The other carried generations of knowledge about how to survive where the cold could kill without warning. First there was cooperation. Then tension. Then fear. And finally silence. The same silence that would remain over the bodies of two priests. The same silence investigators would struggle to penetrate. The same silence that a courtroom, thousands of kilometers away, would try to turn into a verdict. So now we go back. Back to the Arctic before the crime. Back to the Copper Inuit and the world they knew. Back to the missionaries who believed they were beginning a journey of faith. Because before anyone became a victim, before anyone became an accused killer, four men were simply alive. And the path ahead still looked open. They could not see the courtroom waiting years in the future. They could not see the gallows that would later be prepared for two of them. They could not see the newspaper stories, the legal arguments, or the history books. All they could see was the white horizon. And somewhere beyond it, the future was waiting. Cold. Silent. And unforgiving. Long before the case had a file number, long before two Inuit men stood before a southern Canadian court, long before the names Sinisiak and Uliksuk were connected to murder, the land had already been there. The Arctic did not begin with the arrival of missionaries. It did not begin with the arrival of police officers. It did not begin when government maps drew lines across the north and gave distant places names that could be printed in offices thousands of kilometers away. For generations beyond counting, people had lived there. They had learned the moods of the sea. They had learned when ice could hold a human body, and when it could suddenly open beneath a sled. They had learned which winds carried danger. They had learned how to travel when the horizon disappeared into white. And they had learned something that every outsider eventually discovered. In the Arctic, the land does not care who you are. It does not care about your education. It does not care about your religion. It does not care whether you arrive carrying a government order, a rifle, a Bible, or a cross. If you do not understand the land can kill you. This was the world of the Copper Inuit. A world that would become the stage for one of the most unusual and troubling criminal cases in Canadian history. To someone looking at a map from the south, the region might have appeared almost empty. A vast white space. A northern frontier. A place between names. But maps can lie by omission. An empty map does not mean empty land. It can simply mean that the people drawing the map did not know how to see the lives already there. The people of the region knew the land in a way that no map could fully record. Knowledge lived in memory. It lived in stories passed between generations. It lived in the hands of hunters preparing equipment. It lived in the eyes of people reading the surface of the snow. It lived in the decision to leave camp on one morning and remain where they were on another. For the Copper Inuit, survival was never based on the belief that nature could be conquered. It depended on understanding that nature had to be respected. The Arctic could offer food. It could offer routes across ice. It could offer animals, rivers, coastlines, and seasonal patterns that made life possible. But it demanded attention. A mistake could cost a person more than comfort. Could cost a life. The Arctic morning could begin with a sky so pale it was difficult to see where the world ended. Snow covered the ground in every direction. In some seasons, the light seemed endless. In others, darkness pressed down for long hours, swallowing the edges of the landscape. The wind could move quietly at first, brushing across the snow like a whisper. Then, without warning, it could become something else. A force strong enough to make travel dangerous. A force that entered clothing and reached the skin. A force that could erase the tracks behind a sled and make familiar territory feel unfamiliar. This was not a place where people traveled casually. Every journey required preparation. Every journey required knowledge. And every journey carried risk. A man traveling through the Arctic had to understand more than direction. He had to understand time. How many hours of daylight remained? How quickly was the weather changing? How much food was available? Could the dogs continue? Would the ice remain stable? Was there enough fuel and shelter to survive if the journey suddenly stopped? These questions were not theoretical. They were part of daily life. For someone born in the North, much of this knowledge could appear almost instinctive, though it had been learned over years of experience. A slight change in the wind could matter. The appearance of snow could matter. The sound beneath the surface of the ice could matter. A route that looked safe to an outsider might contain danger invisible to an untrained eye. And that difference between knowing the land and merely traveling through it would become essential to the tragedy ahead. Sinisiak and Uliksuk belonged to this northern world. The priests did not. That does not mean the missionaries were weak men. It does not mean they were foolish. Traveling into the Arctic at the beginning of the 20th century required courage. It required physical endurance. It required a willingness to leave behind almost everything familiar. But courage and understanding are not the same thing. A brave man can still become lost. A determined man can still misunderstand the people around him. And a person with a powerful sense of purpose can become blind to the fact that he has entered someone else's world. That was one of the deepest tensions of the period. By the early 20th century, the Canadian Arctic was becoming increasingly important to institutions in the South. The church saw communities to reach. Government officials saw territory to administer. Police saw a region where Canadian law was expected to extend. Explorers saw a frontier. Traders saw opportunity. But the people already living there saw something else. They saw home. And the difference between those perspectives could be enormous. To arrive in a place believing that you have come to bring civilization is to arrive with an assumption. The assumption is that the people waiting there need what you have. The assumption is that your religion, your law, your customs, and your understanding of the world should eventually become theirs. But what happens when the people you have come to change know more about the land than you ever will? What happens when the person you consider your guide is not simply helping you move from one point to another, but is actually carrying the knowledge that keeps you alive? The relationship becomes complicated. On paper, one person may appear to have authority. In reality, survival can reverse that hierarchy. A missionary may be a spiritual leader. A government officer may represent the law. But when the wind rises and the trail disappears, the person who understands the land becomes indispensable. That was the reality of travel in the Arctic. Independence can create respect. But it can also create resentment. Imagine two men arriving from far away, carrying a mission they believe is important. They have been educated. They belong to a powerful religious institution. They have crossed great distances because they believe they are doing meaningful work. Then, in the Arctic, they discover that much of their survival depends on people who do not share their background, their religion, or their assumptions about authority. They need guides. They need local knowledge. They need help with travel. They need people who can read a landscape that looks almost featureless to the untrained eye. For the Copper Inuit, this knowledge was not a gift freely invented for the benefit of outsiders. It was the result of generations of life in the North. And that is where the first invisible line in this story begins to appear. The missionaries were entering the region with a purpose. But the Inuit men were not simply background characters in that purpose. They had their own lives, their own families, their own responsibilities, their own understanding of what they were owed when they worked. That mattered. Because one of the tensions that later emerged between the traveling companions involved expectations and payment. In any other place, a disagreement over promised goods might have been unpleasant but manageable. In the Arctic, where tools, weapons, and equipment could carry enormous practical value, such disagreements could take on greater importance. A broken promise was not always just an insult, could affect survival. Imagine agreeing to work for someone because you expect to receive valuable supplies in return. You give your time. You travel with them. You carry responsibilities. You use your knowledge to help them move through a dangerous environment. Then you begin to suspect that the agreement may not be honored. Anger enters the relationship. Trust weakens. And in a place where the same people must continue traveling together, there is no easy way to walk away from the conflict. The journey itself becomes a pressure chamber. The landscape surrounding the men was vast, but their lives during travel could become intensely close. They ate near one another. They rested near one another. They depended on the same supplies. They watched each other's behavior. And when tension developed, there was nowhere for it to disappear. Simply moved with them. This is one of the reasons the Arctic setting is so important to understanding the case. The land was not merely a backdrop. It was an active force in the relationship. The cold affected the body. Distance affected the mind. Isolation magnified conflict. Dependence made trust essential. And when trust began to collapse, there were few outside forces capable of stopping what came next. There was no village around the corner where the men could ask someone to mediate an argument. No police officer could be summoned to separate them. No hotel room existed where one person could lock the door and spend the night away from the others. They were together. And the farther they traveled, the more dangerous that togetherness could become. The Arctic of 1913 was also a place undergoing change. For generations, the Copper Inuit had lived according to systems of knowledge and social relationships shaped by the realities of the North. But outsiders were arriving more frequently. Missionaries, traders, explorers, government representatives, police. Each arrival carried more than people and equipment. It carried ideas. Ideas about religion, ideas about property, ideas about authority, ideas about law. And when those ideas entered an existing society, they did not always fit neatly. The most dangerous conflicts are not always created by open hatred. Sometimes they begin with misunderstanding. One person believes he is giving an order. Another hears disrespect. One person believes he is enforcing discipline. Another sees a threat. One person believes he is offering help. Another sees control. Neither side may fully understand what the other is thinking. And when communication itself is difficult, misunderstanding can grow in the empty spaces between words. Language was one of those spaces. The missionaries and the Inuit men did not come from the same linguistic world. Communication required effort. Meaning could be translated, simplified, altered, or misunderstood. A phrase spoken with frustration could sound more threatening to someone who already felt unsafe. A warning could be interpreted as a threat. A gesture could speak louder than any translation. And a weapon required no translation at all. Everyone understood what a gun could do. That would become important. But before the gun, before the violence, and before the fear became impossible to control, there was the broader world in which these four men lived. The Copper Inuit were not simply surviving against nature every day in some isolated and primitive existence, as many outsiders of the era might have imagined. Their lives were organized around deep knowledge of the environment, family connections, seasonal movement, hunting practices, and social relationships. The North required cooperation. A single person could not simply declare independence from everyone else and expect to survive indefinitely. Knowledge was shared. Work was shared. Resources could become matters of collective importance. The success of one journey could affect more than one person. And the failure of another could be remembered for years. This was a world in which relationships mattered. Reputation mattered. Promises mattered. At the same time, the missionaries represented another system of relationships. They belonged to an institution built around hierarchy and spiritual authority. Their purpose was not simply to visit. They had come to convert, to teach, to establish a religious presence, to reshape lives according to beliefs they considered true. From their perspective, the mission may have been an act of service. From another perspective, it could also represent intrusion. This is not to say that every interaction between missionaries and Inuit people was hostile. Human relationships are rarely that simple. There could be cooperation, curiosity, friendship, mutual assistance. But there could also be distrust. And the possibility of conflict was always present when people with unequal power and different assumptions came together. The case of Sinisiak and Uliksuk emerged from that larger historical landscape. It did not appear out of nowhere. The killings happened during a period when the Arctic was becoming increasingly connected to Southern institutions that wanted to establish themselves there. The church was one of those institutions. The Canadian government was another. And the legal consequences of the killings would later reveal how deeply connected those institutions could become to questions of authority. Because once the priests were dead, the government faced more than a criminal investigation. It faced a challenge to the idea that Canadian law had power in the Arctic. That larger question was still ahead. For now, the focus remained on the land. A land where 4 men were preparing to travel. 2 of them knew the region as home. 2 of them had entered it with faith and purpose. The difference between those positions may have seemed manageable at the beginning. A guide and a traveler. A worker and an employer. A local man and a missionary. But categories can become unstable under pressure, especially when survival depends on cooperation. The weather did not recognize rank. The cold did not care who had authority. And hunger did not respect religious status. Out on the trail, every man could become vulnerable. Perhaps that vulnerability was one of the hidden forces behind the tension that followed. People who feel in control often behave differently when they suddenly become dependent. Imagine a man who has spent his life believing in his own ability, his education, his mission, and his authority. Then he enters a world where he must ask others when it is safe to travel. He must rely on their judgment. He must accept that they can see danger before he can. For some people, that dependence creates humility. For others, it can create frustration. And frustration can be dangerous when mixed with exhaustion. Long journeys wear people down. The body becomes tired. The cold makes every task harder. Small problems feel larger. A disagreement that might be ignored in comfort can become unbearable when everyone is hungry, exhausted, and exposed to the weather. The Arctic does not merely test physical strength. It tests patience. And patience, according to later accounts of this case, was already in short supply. Father Leroux would later become an important figure in the story of fear that Sinisiak and Uliksuk described. He was said to have been quick-tempered. That does not tell us exactly what happened. It does not prove that he intended to harm anyone. But temperament matters when a relationship is already under pressure. A harsh voice can be dismissed once. Repeated again, it becomes part of a pattern. A person who already feels disrespected may begin watching for the next sign of anger. And eventually, fear can become a lens. Every new action is seen through it. This is how a relationship can reach a dangerous point without anyone noticing the exact moment when it crossed the line. There is no bell. No warning light. No voice announcing that trust has now become suspicion. One day, people simply realize they no longer feel safe with someone they were traveling beside. By then it may already be too late. As 1913 moved toward its final months, the Arctic was entering the time of deeper cold. The days changed. The weather hardened. Travel became a greater test. For the 4 men at the center of this future tragedy, the journey was not occurring inside a comfortable world. It was occurring in an environment where the smallest decisions could matter. When to stop. Where to camp. What route to take. How much to carry. Who controlled the equipment. Who possessed the weapons. Every practical detail also had the potential to become a question of trust. And trust, once damaged, can make ordinary objects feel dangerous. A rifle can become more than a tool. A knife can become more than equipment. An axe can become more than something used for work. The objects remain unchanged. The relationship around them changes. And then suddenly everything looks different. That was the world closing in around Sinisiak, Uliksuk, Father Riviere, and Father Leroux. 4 men moving through a landscape larger than anything most people could imagine. 4 men connected by a journey. 4 men carrying different expectations. different beliefs, different experiences of authority, different ideas about what was being promised and what was being owed. At first, perhaps, none of it seemed destined to end in blood. Most tragedies do not announce themselves. They begin quietly, with a disagreement, with impatience, with a promise that someone believes has been broken, with one man feeling he is not being heard, with another man feeling that he is losing control. Then comes a look, a gesture, a weapon. And suddenly the entire history of the relationship arrives in one moment. The Arctic had seen countless journeys before. People had traveled across ice and snow for generations. Most of them were never remembered outside the communities that experienced them. This journey would be different. It would become evidence. Every disagreement would later be examined. Every movement would become a possible clue. Every object would be given meaning. Years later, lawyers would speak about events that had happened in a place where they had never stood. Juries would imagine the cold without feeling it. Judges would interpret fear without experiencing the isolation that shaped it. But before all of that, there was still time, still distance, still a trail stretching into the white horizon. The men were alive. The priests still carried their mission. Sinisiak and Uliksuk still had their knowledge of the land. The future had not yet revealed itself. And perhaps from a distance the journey looked almost ordinary. For men moving north, a religious mission continuing, guides and travelers working together. Nothing on the horizon suggesting that this expedition would eventually produce 2 corpses, 2 murder trials, death sentences, and a legal controversy that would outlive everyone involved. That is the frightening thing about the beginning of a tragedy. From far enough away, it often looks like an ordinary day. The snow falls. The wind moves. People continue walking. And somewhere, without anyone fully understanding it, the first crack appears. In the next chapter, we move closer to the people at the center of this story. Not the defendants yet. Not the killers yet. Not simply the names that would appear in a court record. But the men whose lives would be destroyed in the Arctic. Father Jean-Baptiste Rivière and Father Guillaume Leroux. Who were they before the journey? Why did they travel so far from home? What did they believe they were bringing to the north? And how did 2 men who had come to the Arctic carrying a mission of faith find themselves at the center of a deadly confrontation from which they would never return? To understand the crime, we first have to understand the men who died. Because before they became victims, they were living human beings. And their story had begun long before the snow turned red. Father Jean-Baptiste Rivière and Father Guillaume Leroux did not come to the Arctic by accident. They had not wandered north in search of adventure. They had not simply followed a trail until the land became colder, and the settlements disappeared behind them. They came with a mission. And in the world they came from, a mission was not merely a job. It was a calling. To leave home, cross enormous distances, and travel into regions where the language, climate, customs, and people were unfamiliar required a particular kind of conviction. These were men who believed that the difficulties ahead of them were part of a larger purpose. Cold could be endured. Hunger could be endured. Distance could be endured. Because beyond the hardship was the work they believed they had been sent to do. The Catholic Church had been moving into remote regions of Canada for decades, following communities that had long lived beyond the reach of the institutions of Southern society. Missionaries traveled where government officials were only beginning to establish a presence. They followed rivers, coastlines, and winter routes. They built missions. They learned languages, sometimes imperfectly. They tried to teach, convert, and establish a religious foothold in places where Christianity had not traditionally shaped daily life. For the men who volunteered for that work, the Arctic could represent both sacrifice and spiritual purpose. But conviction can be a dangerous companion when it enters another person's home carrying the belief that it knows what is best. That is one of the tensions surrounding this story. Father Rivière and Father Leroux were not criminals traveling north with plans for violence. Nothing about the basic facts of the case suggests that they entered the Arctic intending to harm the 2 Inuit men who would later be accused of killing them. They came as missionaries. They came with faith. They came with the authority of their church. And they came carrying assumptions formed in a world very different from the one they were entering. Those assumptions would matter. Because the farther north they traveled, the more dependent they became on the people they had come to reach. It is easy to imagine the Arctic as a blank landscape when seen from a distance. A great white emptiness. A place where the eye sees almost nothing except snow, ice, and sky. But for the people who lived there, the land was full of information. A coastline was not simply a coastline. It carried memory. A river was not merely a blue line on a map. It was a route, a source of food, a place associated with seasons and travel. The surface of the snow was not simply white. Its shape could reveal the movement of wind. The ice was not simply frozen water. Its appearance and sound could mean the difference between safe passage and sudden death. Father Riviere and Father Leroux had entered a world where their education could not replace that knowledge. A Bible could not tell them whether the ice would hold. A religious title could not guide a sled through a blizzard. Faith might give a man the strength to continue, but it could not tell him which direction to go when the horizon disappeared. That was why the local knowledge of men like Sinisiak and Uliksuk mattered so much. The Inuit men were not simply hired hands carrying supplies behind the missionaries. They were part of the system that made the journey possible. They knew how to move through the environment. They understood the practical demands of travel. They knew the rhythms of a landscape that could become deadly to people who treated it as an empty frontier. Yet the relationship between someone who provides essential knowledge and someone who believes he has authority is not always comfortable. A person can depend on another man and still resent that dependence. He can need help while believing he should be the one in control. He can accept guidance while quietly resisting the idea that someone else knows more than he does. And when exhaustion enters the picture, those tensions can become sharper. Think about the priest's journey. They were far from the familiar structures of their former lives. Far from churches. Far from established communities. Far from the routines that might once have defined their days. There were no bells announcing the hour. No comfortable rooms waiting at the end of the evening. No easy access to medical help. No quick journey back to a town if something went wrong. The Arctic demanded physical endurance. The men had to move when travel was possible. They had to stop when the land or weather demanded it. They had to carry supplies. They had to trust the judgment of those around them. And they had to do all of this while carrying the psychological burden of isolation. Isolation changes people. At first, silence can feel peaceful. Then, after days of travel, it can begin to feel oppressive. A person becomes more aware of every sound. The scrape of a sled across snow. The breathing of the dogs. The crack of ice somewhere in the distance. The sudden change in the wind. The voice of a traveling companion. And when the same small group of people spends every day together, every personality becomes impossible to ignore. The patient person becomes a comfort. The angry person becomes a source of tension. The quiet person may begin to seem distant. The confident person may appear controlling. Small habits that would be meaningless in ordinary life begin to take up space inside the mind. For Father Riviere and Father Leroux, the journey was also a test of their mission. They were not merely passing through the Arctic. They were attempting to establish a connection with communities whose world was not organized around Catholic doctrine. That required more than traveling. It required trust. And trust cannot simply be demanded. A person may carry a religious message, but the people hearing it are not empty vessels waiting to be filled. They have beliefs already. They have stories already. They have explanations for the world around them. They have relationships with the land and with one another. The arrival of a missionary can therefore be both an encounter and a disruption. The missionary may believe he is offering salvation. The person receiving him may see a stranger carrying unfamiliar rules. Neither description automatically captures the entire truth. But the tension between them is real. The case of Sinisiak and Uliksuk unfolded within that tension. The missionaries came from a world in which the church had structure, hierarchy, and authority. Their lives were shaped by vows and responsibilities. They were representatives of an institution much larger than themselves. When they traveled north, they carried that identity with them. A cross around a man's neck could inspire reverence in one person and mean nothing to another. A title such as Father carried authority among Catholics. But authority is never universal simply because one person believes it should be. The Copper Inuit did not suddenly become part of the missionaries' social world because two priests had arrived. They remained people with their own ways of living. And Sinisiak and Uliksuk remained individuals with their own interests, expectations, and sense of dignity. That distinction is important because the tragedy that followed did not begin with four people who shared the same understanding of their relationship. They were traveling together, but they were not necessarily traveling through the same world. One group may have viewed the journey as part of a religious mission. The other may have understood it through work, obligation, exchange, and survival. The missionaries may have believed they were directing the larger purpose. The Inuit men possessed knowledge that could determine whether the journey succeeded at all. From the beginning, there was an imbalance. Not a simple imbalance in which one side possessed all the power. The power shifted depending on the situation. The priests represented an enormous religious institution. The Inuit men represented intimate knowledge of the environment. The priests possessed equipment and goods. The Inuit men knew how and where to travel. The priests came from a society increasingly connected to the authority of the Canadian state. The Inuit men belonged to communities that had existed in the region long before that authority arrived. Each side had something the other needed. And that kind of dependence can create either cooperation or conflict. For a time, cooperation was possible. The men traveled together. There was a practical arrangement. Sinisiak and Uliksuk helped the missionaries move through the Arctic. In return, there were expectations of payment in valuable goods, including trapping equipment. But arrangements between people can become dangerous when the terms are not understood in exactly the same way. Perhaps one side believed the agreement was clear. Perhaps the other believed promises were being delayed or broken. Perhaps the difference began as a simple dispute. We do not need to invent words that were never recorded to understand how such a conflict could grow. The basic situation itself was enough to create pressure. The Inuit men were providing labor and knowledge. They expected compensation. If they began to believe that they would not receive what had been promised, the relationship could quickly become strained. And in the Arctic, useful goods were not meaningless luxuries. A trap could have practical value. A weapon could have practical value. A supply of ammunition could matter. Equipment was tied to survival and livelihood. A disagreement over goods could therefore carry emotional weight far beyond the value of the objects themselves. It could become a question of respect, a question of trust, a question of whether one man believed another had treated him fairly. Once fairness becomes part of a conflict, every later disagreement can become connected to it. A raised voice is no longer just a raised voice. It becomes another example. A refusal is no longer just a refusal. It becomes proof. A disagreement over the journey becomes part of a larger story, in which one side begins to feel controlled or cheated. This is how distrust builds. Not always through one enormous event. Sometimes it grows through accumulation. Person remembers. He keeps count. He notices a pattern. And eventually, the next argument arrives carrying the weight of all the previous ones. According to later accounts connected to the case, Father Guillaume Leroux was described as having a difficult temper. That detail matters not because it automatically makes him responsible for his own death. It does not. No personality trait can serve as a simple explanation for murder. But in a tense relationship, temperament can shape how others interpret a person's behavior. If a man is repeatedly impatient, people begin expecting impatience. If he frequently raises his voice, a later shout can sound more dangerous than it otherwise would. If he expresses anger around weapons, the people beside him may begin to wonder where that anger will lead. And once fear enters a relationship, interpretation becomes unstable. A person may see danger before danger is actually present. But sometimes, fear develops because a person has learned to expect something from past behavior. That is the difficult question at the heart of the coming tragedy. Were Sinisiak and Uliksuk imagining a threat that did not exist? Or were they responding to behavior that had convinced them, rightly or wrongly, that their lives were in danger? We cannot answer that question yet. Not until we move closer to the journey itself. But we can understand the world in which the question was born. It was a world of unequal understanding. The missionaries could not see the Arctic through Inuit eyes. The Inuit men could not necessarily understand the private intentions of the missionaries. Communication existed, but it could be imperfect. Translation could carry meaning from one language into another, but it could also lose something along the way. Tone is difficult to translate. Fear is difficult to translate. Humiliation is difficult to translate. A gesture, however, can cross any language. And so can violence. Imagine an argument in the cold. Words spoken quickly. One person frustrated. Another trying to respond. Perhaps the meaning of a sentence is only partly understood. Perhaps someone interrupts. Perhaps someone moves closer. The distance between bodies changes. The temperature is low. The men are tired. Everyone knows where the weapons are. No translation is needed for that. At moments like that, the human mind begins filling in gaps. What is he going to do? Why is his hand moving? Why did his voice change? Why is he standing so close? The answers may not be known, but fear often provides them anyway. The Arctic itself intensified this process. In a crowded city, an argument can end because someone walks away. There are other people, other rooms, other streets. In the wilderness, separation is not always possible. If 4 men are days from help, they cannot simply stop needing one another because they are angry. They must continue traveling. Or they must find a way to survive separately. And either choice can be dangerous. That is why trust becomes more than an emotional concept. It becomes equipment. As essential as food. As essential as shelter. A group traveling through extreme conditions must believe that the people around them will not abandon them, betray them, or harm them. Once that belief disappears, every part of the journey becomes unstable. Who sleeps first? Who watches the supplies? Who holds the weapon? Who decides where the group goes? Who can be trusted when everyone is exhausted? Those questions may have been unspoken, but they were becoming increasingly important. And while the relationship between the 4 men tightened under pressure, another force was moving toward them from far away: the law. At the time of the journey, the idea of Canadian legal authority in the Arctic was becoming increasingly significant. The North was not outside history. Government officials were paying greater attention to it. Police posts and state institutions were part of a broader effort to establish and demonstrate control. Missionaries, traders, police, and officials could each arrive with different immediate purposes, but their presence collectively changed the region. The Arctic was becoming more tightly connected to systems of authority based far to the south. For the Inuit, this meant that acts committed in their own homeland could eventually be interpreted and punished by institutions that did not emerge from their communities. The law was traveling north. It traveled slowly. It did not always arrive with a courtroom. Sometimes it arrived with a uniform. Sometimes with an official document. Sometimes with a missionary. And sometimes, after a tragedy had already occurred, it arrived with handcuffs. That was still in the future for Sinisiak and Uliksuk. For now, the men were simply part of a journey. But the future courtroom was already waiting in a sense. The rules that would later judge them already existed. The death penalty already existed. The machinery of prosecution already existed. The judges and lawyers did not know these names yet. But eventually the names would reach them. And when they did, the Arctic would be forced into a courtroom. This is one of the strangest images in the entire case. A vast landscape that could not be controlled by walls would later be reconstructed inside a room. The snow would become testimony. The weapons would become exhibits. The fear would become a legal argument. The dead would become victims. The survivors would become defendants. But something would always be missing: the experience itself. No courtroom could reproduce the wind. No jury could truly feel the isolation. No legal transcript could make someone understand what it meant to believe that help was days or weeks away. The law could ask what a reasonable person would have done. But who, exactly, was the reasonable person in this story? A man living in a southern city? A missionary traveling through unfamiliar territory? An Inuit guide who understood the risks of the land? That question was never as simple as it looked. The coming tragedy would expose the difference between universal law and individual experience. A law may claim to apply equally to everyone, but people do not experience the world equally. Two men can stand in the same place and see completely different dangers. Two people can hear the same words and understand different meanings. Two groups can enter the same journey believing they are cooperating, while quietly disagreeing about almost everything beneath the surface. And eventually, the smallest misunderstanding can become the last misunderstanding. The snow did not change color in advance. The sky did not announce that two men were about to die. The dogs continued. The sleds moved. The days passed. But the tension was there. Growing. Waiting. By the final stretch of the journey, Father Riviere and Father Leroux were no longer simply two missionaries carrying out a religious mission. They were part of a small, isolated group whose internal trust was beginning to weaken. Sinisiak and Uliksuk were no longer simply guides helping strangers cross the land. They were men who, according to their later accounts, were becoming increasingly afraid. And somewhere in the space between those two realities, violence was waiting. To understand what happened next, we have to leave the broad landscape behind and move closer to the men themselves. We have to look at Father Jean-Baptiste Riviere and Father Guillaume Leroux not simply as names connected to a murder case, but as two individuals. Two men who had chosen a difficult path. Two men who had left behind the familiar. Two men who carried faith into a world they could never fully control. They had hopes. They had expectations. They had personalities. They had reasons for being there. And whatever mistakes, tensions, or misunderstandings developed during the journey, one fact must remain at the center of their story. They were alive when the journey began. They had a future when they set out. Somewhere beyond the next stretch of ice, they may have imagined the mission continuing. Another camp. Another conversation. Another community. Another day. They could not know that the road ahead would end in violence. They could not know that their names would become inseparable from one of the most controversial trials in Canadian Arctic history. And they could not know that, years after their deaths, people would still be asking whether their final journey was destroyed by greed, fear, cultural misunderstanding, or something even more complicated. But the land knew none of that. The Arctic continued as it always had. Wind across snow. Ice beneath the runners. A pale horizon stretching beyond sight. And for men moving through it. Closer and closer to the moment when trust would finally disappear. By the time the final journey began to take shape, the Arctic was no longer merely the distant setting of this story. It had become part of every decision the men would make. The land controlled the pace. The weather controlled the routes. The cold controlled how long a man could remain exposed. And distance controlled the consequences of every mistake. For Father Jean-Baptiste Riviere and Father Guillaume Leroux, traveling through this region meant carrying a mission into a world where almost nothing could be taken for granted. For Sinisiak and Uliksuk, it meant moving through a homeland they understood, but now sharing the journey with men who brought unfamiliar expectations, unfamiliar authority, and a purpose that did not belong to the old rhythms of the land. At first glance, the arrangement seemed practical. The missionaries needed assistance. The Inuit men possessed the knowledge necessary for travel. The group could move together. Each side had something the other needed. But practical arrangements can conceal fragile relationships. A partnership may function perfectly when everyone feels respected. It can begin to fracture when one person believes he is being treated unfairly. And once suspicion enters, the same journey that once required cooperation can begin to feel like captivity. There was nowhere easy to go. That was the problem. In a city, a disagreement can end when one person walks down the street and disappears into the crowd. A door closes. A train leaves. A friend offers another place to stay. The people involved can place distance between themselves and their anger. In the Arctic, distance could be both a solution and a death sentence. Walking away was not always freedom. Sometimes it meant entering a landscape where food, shelter, and direction were matters of life and death. So when four men became trapped inside a damaged relationship, they could not simply stop being connected to one another. They still needed to travel. They still needed to survive. They still had to wake up each morning and face the same people. The conflict remained inside the group. Traveled with them. It sat beside the fire at night. It followed them across the ice. It entered every conversation. And perhaps that is the best way to understand the atmosphere that eventually surrounded the four men. The violence did not suddenly fall from the sky. It emerged from a journey already carrying tension. A journey where different ideas about work, payment, authority, and trust were beginning to collide. Sinisiak and Uliksuk had agreed to assist the missionaries. But according to later accounts, there were disputes connected to what the men expected to receive for their work. The question of payment may sound ordinary to someone listening from a modern world, but in the Arctic, practical goods carried weight. Equipment could mean the ability to hunt. A weapon could mean protection or food. A trap could mean future livelihood. Supplies could determine whether a difficult season became survivable. So if a man believed that he had been promised something important and then began to think that the promise would not be honored, the issue could become far larger than an argument over property. Could become personal. A promise is not simply about an object. It is about whether another person considers you worthy of honesty. That is where resentment often begins. Not in the value of the thing itself, but in the feeling that the other person has decided you do not deserve fairness. For people living and traveling in close proximity, resentment has time to grow. There are no distractions. No crowded streets. No endless noise to bury an argument. The mind returns to what happened. Again and again. A man remembers the words. He remembers the expression on another person's face. He remembers who laughed. Who refused. Who turned away. And in the cold, exhausted hours of a difficult journey, those memories can become heavier. Then there was the question of authority. The missionaries were men accustomed to belonging to an institution with a clear hierarchy. The church gave their mission structure. Their position gave them a sense of responsibility. They were not wandering travelers without purpose. They believed they had been sent. They had work to do. They had people to reach. But a sense of mission can sometimes become a sense of entitlement. A person who believes deeply in the importance of his purpose may begin to expect others to accept his decisions simply because he is convinced that those decisions are right. In another environment, that confidence might pass unnoticed. In the Arctic, where the missionaries depended on Inuit knowledge, it could become a source of friction. The men guiding them were not servants of the land. They were people who belonged to it. They knew routes the missionaries did not know. They understood dangers the missionaries could not always see. They knew when a decision could lead a group toward safety or disaster. If they disagreed with the priests, the disagreement was not necessarily a challenge to faith. It could be a question of survival. But did everyone understand that distinction? That is difficult to know. And the uncertainty matters. Because many deadly conflicts begin when two people think they are arguing about different things. One man believes he is defending authority. Another believes he is defending his life. One believes the other is being disobedient. The other believes he is being forced into danger. The words may sound similar. The meanings are not. For Father Riviere and Father Leroux, the journey demanded trust in the men who knew the North. For Sinisiak and Uliksuk, the journey demanded trust in strangers who carried weapons and controlled access to valuable supplies. That was the fragile balance. Each side depended on the other. Yet each side may also have had reasons to question the other. And the more tension grew, the more dangerous that balance became. The missionaries had come north carrying the confidence of their faith. Sinisiak and Uliksuk carried the confidence of experience. One form of knowledge came from books, doctrine, and institutions. The other came from generations of living in a land where mistakes could not always be corrected. Neither side was automatically incapable of understanding the other. But understanding requires humility. It requires the ability to say, "Perhaps I do not know everything." That can be difficult for anyone. It can be especially difficult when power is involved. By the early 20th century, the North was changing. The arrival of missionaries was one sign. The growing presence of police and government authority was another. To many officials in the South, the Arctic was a region that needed to be brought more firmly under Canadian administration. The language of sovereignty and authority could sound abstract in government offices. But on the ground it meant something very real. More outsiders arrived. More rules arrived with them. And eventually, actions that might once have been handled within local systems of custom and community could be taken into distant courts. The Sinisiak and Uliksuk case would become one of the clearest examples of this transformation. The killings would not remain a local tragedy. They would be pulled into the legal machinery of Canada. The accused would be removed from the world where the confrontation had occurred. Their actions would be examined according to laws written and enforced by people from another society. Their fear would be interpreted through translation. Their motives would be debated by lawyers. And their lives would be placed in the hands of strangers. But all of that came later. Before the police. Before the trial. Before the sentence of death. There was simply the journey. And journeys can reveal people. The longer people travel together, the harder it becomes to maintain appearances. Exhaustion strips away patience. Hunger strips away politeness. Cold strips away comfort. A person who is calm in a warm room may become irritable after days of difficult travel. A disagreement that could be solved over a table may become explosive when everyone is tired. The Arctic did not create every conflict between the men, but it may have intensified every weakness already present. Imagine a morning in the camp. The sky is pale. The air cuts against the face before the sun has fully risen. Hands move slowly because the cold has stiffened them. Equipment must be checked. Food must be prepared. The route must be discussed. The dogs must be managed. Every task takes energy. And somewhere in the middle of all this, one man says something another does not like. Perhaps the voice is sharper than usual. Perhaps someone believes an order has been given. Perhaps someone answers back. No one can simply walk away and forget it. The work continues. But the argument remains. That is how tension can become part of the environment. It becomes as familiar as the wind. By the time the four men approached the final stage of their journey, they were carrying more than supplies. They were carrying memory. Sinisiak remembered the disputes. Uliksuk remembered them too. The priests had their own memories of the journey, their own frustrations, their own concerns. No one knows exactly how each man privately interpreted every disagreement. But we know what happened in the end. The relationship failed completely. And when it did, there was no one nearby to stop the violence. This is where the physical setting becomes almost unbearable to imagine. For men in a world of enormous emptiness, the nearest help impossibly far away. No telephone. No radio. No quick rescue. No emergency services. If someone became sick, the group had to deal with it. If equipment failed, the group had to improvise. If two men turned against the other two, there was nowhere to run for immediate protection. The isolation turned every threat into something larger. A gun pointed in anger was not simply a moment of intimidation. It could mean that no one would ever arrive in time to save you. A physical confrontation could not be broken up by strangers. Once violence began, the men involved were the only people who could decide when it ended. That is one of the reasons the later legal proceedings could never completely recreate the scene. The law could examine actions. It could examine wounds. It could examine statements. But it could not reproduce the psychological reality of being trapped in a deadly environment with the people you feared. And yet the courts had to try. They had to answer questions that would determine life or death. What did Sinisiak believe was about to happen? What did Uliksuk believe? Did either man have a genuine reason to fear the priests? Was there an immediate threat? Did the accused act in self-defense? Or did they use the idea of fear later as an explanation for deliberate killing? Those questions would eventually become the heart of the case. But fear itself had begun much earlier. Fear rarely appears at full strength without a history. It grows. First, a person becomes uncomfortable, then suspicious, then alert, then convinced that something may happen. And eventually, the mind begins preparing for danger before danger actually arrives. Whether that preparation is wise or mistaken can only be known afterward. But by then it may be too late. According to later accounts, the relationship between the priests and the Inuit men had reached exactly this point. Sinisiak and Uliksuk were becoming afraid. The name of Father Leroux would become particularly important in the later description of the final confrontation. He was remembered as a man capable of anger. And during the final events, the Inuit men would describe his actions with a firearm as the immediate spark that transformed fear into violence. It is important to be careful here. Because the priests did not survive to give their account, that absence can never be repaired. We cannot place words in their mouths. We cannot invent intentions that were never recorded. All we can do is follow the evidence and the testimony that survived. And what survived was a story of growing mistrust. A story in which the men no longer felt secure beside one another. A story in which a weapon became central. And a story in which fear eventually reached a point where it demanded action. Perhaps that is the most terrifying moment in any violent confrontation. The instant before action. There is still time. Someone can lower a weapon. Someone can step back. Someone can speak. Someone can walk away. But then a person decides that waiting is too dangerous. He moves first. And after that, the future changes. For the 4 men traveling through the Arctic, that moment was approaching. The wind still crossed the ice. The sleds still moved. The dogs still followed their routes. The landscape remained vast and silent. Nothing in the sky announced that history was about to become a crime scene. Yet beneath the routine, the atmosphere had changed. Trust was gone. And once trust disappears in a place where survival depends on cooperation, every ordinary action can begin to look like preparation for betrayal. A hand near a weapon. A whispered conversation. A sudden silence. A glance between 2 people. Everything becomes evidence. Everything becomes a warning. And the human mind, once trapped inside fear, begins searching constantly for the sign that will prove the danger is real. For Sinisiak and Uliksuk, according to the accounts that would later emerge, that sign eventually came. But before we reach that frozen moment, we need to understand the 2 men who never returned from the journey. Because history often turns the dead into symbols. A priest becomes the victim. Another becomes the second victim. A name appears in a court record. Then the person begins to disappear behind the label. Father Jean-Baptiste Rouvière and Father Guillaume Leroux were more than the men who died in this case. They had lives before the Arctic. They had families and communities that knew them before they became missionaries. They had made the decision to enter a dangerous and unfamiliar world. They had traveled extraordinary distances. And whatever tensions existed during the final journey, their deaths were violent losses. Somewhere far away, people who cared about them waited for news that would never come. At first, there may have been uncertainty, then concern, then the slow realization that something was wrong, and eventually the terrible truth. They were gone. No final goodbye. No chance to explain what happened. No return from the journey. The people who knew them were left with absence. And absence has its own kind of cruelty. A family can imagine 1,000 possibilities before it learns the truth. Perhaps the travelers were delayed. Perhaps the weather had trapped them. Perhaps they would appear at the next settlement. But eventually, hope has to confront reality. For the families and religious communities connected to the priests, the Arctic became the place where 2 lives disappeared. And for the Inuit men who survived, it became the place where their own lives were divided into 2 parts. Before the killings. And after. That is the point at which the setting becomes the story itself. The Arctic was not simply where the crime happened. It shaped why the men were together. It shaped their dependence. It shaped their isolation. It shaped the fear described afterward. And it shaped the difficulty of investigating what happened. The cold preserved some evidence. Distance destroyed other evidence. Time delayed the law. And when the courts finally became involved, they were forced to look backward across years and thousands of kilometers. They would try to understand 4 men who had stood alone in the snow. But only 2 of those men could speak. In the next part of this story, we move even closer. We leave the wide horizon behind. We leave the political expansion of Canadian authority behind. And we step into the human stories of the men who died. Who was Father Jean-Baptiste Rouvière before he became a name in a murder trial? Who was Father Guillaume Leroux before his final journey through the Arctic? What drove them so far from home? What did they hope to build in the north? And what did the people around them see when they looked beyond the robes, beyond the mission, beyond the title of father? Because to understand the tragedy that followed, we must first remember the men as they were while they were still alive. Before the snow became a crime scene. Before investigators began asking questions. Before two Inuit men became defendants facing the gallows. Before history chose its words. There were 4 men traveling through the Arctic. And at that moment the ending had not yet happened. But it was getting closer. With every mile across the ice, the distance to safety grew. With every unresolved argument, the distance between the men grew too. And somewhere ahead, beneath a sky as pale and silent as the land itself, the final confrontation was waiting.